A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Skitzal.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide,
Yehuda Gabra with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode about Rav Moshe Rosen, the Nezer Hakodesh, is sponsored by Zelda Litwak-Berger and her husband Sal. She's a granddaughter of Rav Moshe Rosen, and she is dedicating it in honor of her children Deborah and Dr. Meir Abitan and Benjamin and Blimi Berger, and her grandchildren Dr. Baruch and Rabbi Usher and Dr. Netanel and Judah Max and Rezi Abitan, as well as Alexandra, Philip, and Joseph Berger and their families, great-grandchildren, also in honor of the Litwak siblings, grandchildren of Rav Moshe Rosen, Bernice London, Judith Garber, Aleh HaShalom, Dorothy Klempner, Miriam Schiffman, and Rabbi Hillel David Litvak. So, before we get to the very interesting story of Rav Moshe Rosen, the Nezer HaKodesh, so just this week in the Mishpacha magazine, in honor of Hanukkah, there's something very, very special coming up. Not just another article. This is something completely unique, an entire new dimension of Mishpacha magazine. Hope you read the For the Record column every week at the Mishpacha magazine. But you definitely want to make sure to get the magazine this week. You want to get it in print to be able to sit on it a while. There's the feature article is about much more than an article, like I said, is about someone who many assume that you know about. It's arguably one of the more famous Torah leaders, Torah builders of the 20th century, but you'll find out so much more about this individual and his world and history by reading this landmark article. Remarkably, though initially we were allotted our regular page space for the article, which would have provided enough reading material for only one night, a miracle took place and we produced enough reading material to last for 8 nights. So get your Mishpacha magazine and enjoy the surprise when you get it, when it comes out later this week. So in the story of Rav Moshe Rosen, the Nezer HaKodesh, I want to first go out and thank Mrs. Zelda Berger for the information she provided, and I was able to speak to her over the phone for several hours. In preparing this episode, I used a wide range of source material, but none was more valuable and exciting than speaking with a granddaughter of Rav Moshe Rosen. She was very gracious with her time, shared memories, anecdotes, background, family details, a wealth of information, and much of that material is incorporated into this episode, so I want to thank her for her time and for sharing. But there's quite a few articles scattered around about Rav Moshe Rosen and found in several places, so I was able to gather quite a significant amount. Now, my rare trips to the United States, so I generally organize tours which I guide in the Mount Judah Cemetery in Queens, almost like the Har HaMenuchos of America. It's always great to greet Jewish History Soundbites listeners in person. I was there this past summer. Have no idea when the next time that I'll be there. But one of the stories that I discussed and one of the graves that we visit on those tours is of Rav Moshe Rosen, known to posterity by the title of one of his more famous works. There's quite a few Sfarim he wrote, the multi-volume work that he wrote on Shas, on Kodshim primarily, the Nezer Hakodesh, the Holy Crown, a very apt description of him indeed. And with time of going to his caver and preparing material on him for those guided tours, I've come to explore his story further, and I believe that Rav Moshe Rosen's life story is a good prism into the wider context of Jewish life and the development of Orthodox Jewish life during the first half of the 20th century, and that time of immigration from Eastern Europe to the United States and establishing himself in the United States and in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Brownsville. And I think it's a really, really good prism through his life story to really see a lot of what was going on that time. And I think it's a perfect topic for this podcast. And several weeks ago, I did a segment on the Agudath Harabbonim in America and its role, or limited role, or lack of a role in the development of American Jewish life. And at the end of that episode, I mentioned that the organization, I've had a lot of qualifications about the accomplishments of the organization, but I did point out at the end of that episode that the individuals who made it up were quite fascinating, and many of them quite accomplished as well. And therefore, I would rather delve into the lives of some of them. And I invited the listeners of Jewish History Soundbites to further explore this with me together by profiling some of those specific individuals who were prominent in the Agudath Harabbonim. And the family of Rav Moshe Rosen was one of the ones who answered that invitation, and they were gracious enough to sponsor this episode to tell the story of their illustrious forebear, whose prominence in the Agudath Harabbonim, and even serving at its helm as its president for a period of time, is only one facet of his very interesting life story. Rav Moshe Rosen was a prominent communal rabbi in Lithuania, first when it was still part of a Russian empire, in Chveidan, in the town of Chveidan, western Lithuania, and the surrounding area, the surrounding towns, and then when Chveidan was part of independent Lithuania. For 30 years he was the rabbi there, and he was actually the one who discovered the Chazon Ish when he was a young man living in Chveidan, where his wife was from. And he had a very interesting relationship with the Chazon Ish during the Chazon Ish's formative years. He immigrates to the United States in 1928. He served as the first rosh yeshiva of Torah Vodaath. He served as a rabbi in Brownsville. He was a prolific author of the Nezer Hakodesh, the Divrei Sofrim, and then later on, following his passing, his family put together his drushes, helm, and other Sfarim. And he's this well-respected and renowned Torah scholar, halachic paisik, rabbinical leader, until his passing in 1957. So he's through the warriors, and then even the early decade and plus of the post-war renaissance of Orthodoxy in New York City. And outside of New York City, the Renaissance only came later. But the influx of survivors after the war. So he lives through all those time periods, and he's prominent on the Agudath Harabbonim. He also supported other Torah causes, individuals, Torah education. He was involved in the rescue efforts of the Vad Hatzalah during the war. He's a very, very interesting and quite unique person that's worth delving into further. And of course, since it's coming out on Hanukkah, so I was trying to think, how can we somehow pretend to connect this, to make this a Hanukkah episode and connect it to Hanukkah? So we don't have to pretend. There's a very good and strong connection to Hanukkah with Rav Moshe Rosen's life, and that's how I'm going to start talking about him with this Hanukkah connection. So, because it's during the holiday, we all have this experience during Hanukkah that we have to sit through some of these brutally boring Hanukkah parties, and more often than not, it's some sort of family obligation that we need to attend, and we're all in all sorts of uncomfortable social scenarios as a result, with little conversation topics beyond the weather. So as a public service, I'd like to open with a story of Rav Moshe Rosen and a Hanukkah angle that's somewhat not well known. It's from his early years, and it can be a great conversation starter at any Hanukkah party. In addition, you'll also impress whoever you're schmoozing with your knowledge and broadness of intellect. And of course, you shouldn't forget to tell them that you heard it on Jewish History Soundbites and encourage them to listen to the podcast as well if they don't do so already. So the story is as follows. Rav Moshe Rosen, he got married to Hinda Trivash, the daughter of Reb Hillel David HaKohen Trivash, who was the Rav in Vilki in Russia, and not far from Grodno, not far from Kovna, in Lithuania today. And the name Trivash comes from the town of Troyes in France, southeast of Paris, the hometown of Rashi. And these people who were named Trivash were descendants of Rashi. And many descendants of Rashi had a variation of this town. Rashi wasn't a Kohen, but it's at some point it's a matrilineal descent, but they retained the Trivash name because of the prestige of being associated with Rashi. So many descendants of Rashi had a variation of this town as their family name. Either way, Reb Hillel David is the rabbi Vilki, and he was quite a prominent individual in rabbinic circles of the Lithuanian Jewish life towards the end of the 19th century. One of his more famous projects was serving as the editor of the Hapiska Journal, which was an Orthodox periodical and published for nearly a decade between 1895 and about 1904. And it had the distinction of being one of the first Orthodox ones which was actually published in the Russian Empire. Previous ones like Halavanain and others were published outside of Russia and distributed within the Pale of Settlement. But to get a license to publish within Russia was a bit complicated with the Tsarist era censors and all that. So they were primarily published in Vilna by the Ram family printing press, the famous widow and her children who printed the Shas and other books. So they also printed the Hapiska Journal. And the stated goal of the Hapiska Journal, this periodical, was to oppose some of the more popular newspapers like Hamelitz and Hatzfira and similar newspapers which were considered modern and enlightened and progressive, and the Orthodox establishment, which found itself on the defensive by the end of the century, were looking for a media medium to express their message out in I don't know if actually opposition or as to have an alternative voice competing for the Jewish street at the turn of the century. One of the more quirky challenges to tradition swirling around intellectual circles at the time was the story of there was this movement to doubt the veracity of the miracle of the oil in the Hanukkah story lasting 8 days. So what had been and is axiomatic as part of the Hanukkah story is that the miracle of the oil lasting 8 days during the time of the victory of Hanukkah, and there was this doubting the miracle. No, it's not what happened. It didn't really last 8 days. That was one of the claims made at the time. Apparently, it's a dispute if the oil miracle happened altogether, and really the entire celebration was limited to the military victory of the Hasmonean revolt, and the 8 days was related to Sukkot. Either way, there's a lot of material out there on the topic, and I am definitely not the one to know about it. It's a time period of history that I don't study, I don't research. And of course we know, and definitely in our family, in our community, we celebrate the Hanukkah oil miracle victory of 8 days, and we believe in the miracle as it is written in Chazal. But apparently out there's a dispute about it, or at least there was at the end of the 19th century. In any event, Rav Moshe Rosen was a young married student living in his father-in-law's home in Vilki, and he was being supported by his father-in-law at the time of the Hapiska Journal's founding. And at the very first edition of Hapiska, this young, unknown Rav Moshe Rosen contributes a lengthy and scholarly and very impressive article to this first edition, and the article is entitled Arach Lener, and he proves beyond any shadow of doubt, the truth of the oil miracle as the basis of the Hanukkah story, as the basis of the holiday of Hanukkah, that it really lasted 8 days, and it's really true, and it really happened. And this article was an amazing accomplishment. He drew on this incredibly wide variety of sources, and he showed his mastery of all of Talmudic literature and beyond, Midrashim and Rishonim and history, and a full clarity and methodical, and built up his thesis, proving it point by point, disproving his opponent's points, and it was on display for all to see, and it brought him international acclaim. He was completely unknown outside his hometown prior to this publication, and he became the Hanukkah miracle of his day. Rabbinic circles worldwide, as far away as Reb Chizkiah Medini, the Sdei Chemed, highly praised this article and this accomplishment of this young Torah scholar, disproving those who doubted the Hanukkah miracle of the oil. And he contributed to the next 2 editions of the Hapiska Journal as well. So this Hanukkah miracle was Rav Moshe Rosen's initial claim to fame. So when was he born? So one of the articles I read says he was born in 1870. Another article I read says he was born in 1878. The latter claim I found quite amusing because about a page later, the same article claims that he received his rabbinical ordination from the great Kovna rabbi, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, when he was 20 years old. So that would make him receiving it in 1898. So receiving smicha from Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector 2 years after Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan passed away might be one of the strangest things I've heard of in a long time. So in reality, he did receive smicha from Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, and it might have even been before he was 20 years old. It might have been when he was 17 or 18 years old. But it's irrelevant because he was definitely born earlier than 1878. Either he was born in 1870, like the other article said, or possibly a couple of years later, which is what his granddaughter posited when I spoke to her. So he was born in sometime in the early 1870s. Related to his age is another thing I found in the rather bizarre memoir of Reb Mordechai Elephant, where he says that he knew him when he was in Beis HaTalmud by Reb Leib Malin, and he writes there that he knew him when Reb Moshe Rosen was in his 90s. So even if his earliest birth year is 1870, that means he was 87 when he passed away. So if Reb Mordechai Elephant knew him a few years before he passed away when he was in his mid-90s, so that's another, a couple of years off. He never was in his 90s, but that's okay. It's just a few years off. It's not a big deal. Nothing to get too excited about. In any event, he grew up in Bryansk, and he studied locally. He also studied in nearby in Bielsk, and then in Ruzhany. The latter, in Ruzhany, was as a student of Reb Mordechai Gimpel Yaffe. And then, of course, like I said, he received smicha from Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, the Kovna Rav, and also from Moshe Danishevsky of Slobodka at a relatively young age. He then marries, like I said, Hinda Trivash, and then he studied in the famous Kovna Kail for a period of time in preparation for the rabbinate. And he's appointed the rabbi of the Lithuanian town of Chveidan in western Lithuania, near the German border. He was the rabbi there for approximately 30 years until his immigration to the United States in the late 1920s. One of the few rabbis who stayed there through the German occupation during World War I. And he did not flee east to the Russian interior, as did many other rabbinical leaders of his time. And as a result, he assumed rabbinical responsibilities for several surrounding towns as well, Ritva and other places. And he would make his rounds to these other towns and take on that additional responsibility. He also had to deal with the German occupation authorities regarding arrests and food distribution, forced labor, and many other issues. He was very involved in assisting Jewish refugees during the war. The German military officials placed him in charge of bread distribution for the general populace, not just the Jewish community. He had kosher food allocation for the Jewish community and regular food for the general population. He had that responsibility. He was once summoned to a German military tribunal during World War I, due to an informant having related that several Jews were engaged in smuggling merchandise illegally, and it is with the tacit approval and even possibly cooperation of Rav Moshe Rosen, which was unfounded. So he was arrested and taken to this tribunal. He testified before the tribunal. He spoke several languages. He spoke German, he spoke French, he spoke Russian. Of course, he spoke Hebrew and Yiddish, and later he spoke English as well. He knew quite a few languages. But he refused, under this interrogation, he refused to disclose any names of other Jews, and he was ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing, and he was released. During this time, he also risked his life and safety on several occasions in order to rescue Jews who had been arrested by the occupational authorities. His primary what he was known for from his youth was his diligence, his asmada. As a child, he was nicknamed Moshe Masmid, and it was a trait which stuck with him for the rest of his life. He all throughout all the years of his rabbinical leadership and responsibilities in Chveidan and later on in the United States, his primary occupation every day was this hours and hours of intensive Torah study for pretty much most hours of the day. He corresponded with some of the great Torah leaders of his day, Rabbi Yosef Rosen, the Rogatchover, Reb Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, Dar Samech, Reb Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, and several others, Rav Kook. Along with that was his incredibly impressive literary output. He wrote the multi-volume Nezer Hakodesh, which became a classic on Kadshim. He wrote Divrei Seifrim. He wrote on all areas of halacha, as in Psak. His Nezer Hakodesh was considered a foundational sefer. He wrote on Tyrus. The Chazon Ish actually wanted to publish a commentary of Rav Moshe Rosen on Kalim in Tyrus at one point. His speeches were collected after his passing and published in Ohel Moshe. When he published the first volume of Nezer Hakodesh, he sold a volume to the Chafetz Chaim. And the Chafetz Chaim went to the other room to get a ruble to pay for it, and he muttered under his breath, "The rabbis think that they accomplished everything in life with the publication of a sefer. They don't realize that they must continue studying and growing in Torah and never say, 'I'm finished.'" And Rav Moshe Rosen heard the Chafetz Chaim muttering these words under his breath, and possibly the Chafetz Chaim wanted him to hear that. And Rav Moshe Rosen resolved that he, for the rest of his life's mission would be continue to study with a zeal, with a diligence, intensely, continue publishing many more Sfarim, and that's what he do, and he continued to do till the end of his life. And he actually, the majority of his Nezer Hakodesh and his other Sfarim were from his years in the United States, which impressed people, that he continued to publish all these Sfarim as a rabbi in the United States in his old age. One volume was actually published in Vilna when Rav Moshe Rosen was already in Brooklyn. So it was under the supervision of the Chazon Ish. He published it for him and added comments as well. The rest were published in America. Following World War I and the establishment of independent Lithuania, he helped organize the Agudath Harabbonim of Lithuania. He served as one of its leaders. One of the most interesting aspects of his life was his relationship with the Chazon Ish during the years in Chveidan. Rav Moshe Rosen was actually the Chazon Ish's Mesader Kedushin when the Chazon Ish married his wife Basha, who was from Chveidan. One of Rav Moshe Rosen's oldest daughter, Leah, later on Leah Litvak, when she was 7-8 years old, she would volunteer to help the wife of the Chazon Ish on market day. She ran a fabric store, and the Chazon Ish would come and help her on the market days when it was busy. So in order to allow the Chazon Ish to continue to study Torah, even on the market days, so this little girl, 7-8 years old, would go out to the market and help the Chazon Ish's wife roll the fabric. She was so young and short, she had to stand on a box to this Leah Rosen Litvak to help the Chazon Ish's wife. So it's an interesting family connection also. The Rav Moshe Rosen and the Chazon Ish would study together. Essentially, Rav Moshe Rosen is the one who discovers him, and he's likely the one who informed Reb Chaim Ozer Grodzinski about this young man, this young unknown gem, treasure in Chveidan, the Chazon Ish. In town, the two of them would organize shiurim together. It's possible that the Chazon Ish even was invited by Rav Moshe Rosen to occasionally sit on the Bezdin in town. One of the articles I read had an apocryphal story about a mikveh fixing in Chveidan that the Chazon Ish and Rav Moshe Rosen together. It could be that the actual story is true. What I liked about the story is that the story referred to another rabbi in Chveidan, and clearly they meant to say that this rabbi was modern or progressive. He was like the antagonist of the story. But the way the article wrote it was that they wrote that this other rabbi, this modern progressive rabbi, was a neolog rabbi. So here we have a fascinating scenario, which is not recorded anywhere else, is that you have a Hungarian neolog in the middle of Lithuania. So my assumption is that the one who wrote the article had no idea what neolog was and did not know that it was exclusively in Hungary, and there's not a chance that there would anyone be associated with the neolog movements in the middle of Lithuania. That would just be impossible. So they probably just meant to write a modernist rabbi, and they somehow the term neolog came out instead. In any event, another story between Rav Moshe Rosen and the Chazon Ish was his encouraging Rav Moshe Rosen to visit one of the townspeople who were sick. And Rav Moshe Rosen asked him why the Chazon Ish thought it was so important to do so. And the Chazon Ish said that he noticed that the relationship between the husband and the wife has been problematic lately, so a visit from the town rabbi, ostensibly to visit him as a sick person, would help smooth things out between the husband and wife as well. So I found that interesting too. Now, in their studying together, the Nezer Hakodesh would defer to the Chazon Ish and treat him as his teacher, even though he was the rabbi, the older one. But he understood the greatness of the Chazon Ish even already as a young man. The townspeople had no idea who this fellow was. The whole thing was pretty much kept under the wraps and a secret. But in summary, Rav Moshe Rosen was truly the first person to see the Chazon Ish for who he was. They kept a relationship for the rest of their life. They corresponded when he was in America and the Chazon Ish was already in Israel. They corresponded. His granddaughter told me they even spoke occasionally on the phone, on the telephone. So that was a very interesting relationship. Rav Moshe Rosen supported the Chazon Ish in his later years, also financially. In 1928, Rav Moshe Rosen moved to the United States. He immigrated there. He had lots of family there. His family had moved there earlier. Even his parents, most of his family had abandoned Jewish observance. Rav Moshe Rosen maintained a good relationship with them, even though they'd immigrated to the United States much earlier and already abandoned Jewish observance. And so Rav Moshe Rosen and his family, his wife and children, were the only ones who were religious, but they were the ones who were able to bring him over. And it's unclear why he had to leave at that point. It seems that recovery from the war, from World War I, was difficult. His house was burnt at one point, so he had to move. In America, he had several positions. He had his position, his later position. He was a rabbi for a short time in one shul. Then his main position was in the Amboy Street Shul, Anshe Radishkovitz, which was a very, very prominent, one of the largest shuls in Brownsville. His granddaughter told me that now recently Brownsville is experiencing urban renewal, and Chabad have just bought back this old building and are renewing it, which is a fascinating story. I wasn't aware how much Brownsville is renewing as a Jewish community now. But then Brownsville was one of the main Jewish neighborhoods of New York City, and this Anshe Radishkovitz, they were very prominent shuls. He was a rabbi there for several years, and he also was the first rosh yeshiva of Torah Vodaath. He was invited by Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich. And I used to think that Reb David Leibowitz was the first rosh yeshiva. I think I even said so on one of the earliest Jewish history soundbites episodes about Torah Vodaath, way back a few years ago. But subsequent research seems to indicate that in fact Rav Moshe Rosen was the first rosh yeshiva of Torah Vodaath, and Reb David Leibowitz was only afterwards. I even, a listener actually sent me an audio of Rabbi Yisrael Belsky discussing the history of the yeshiva, and he mentioned this as well. and it seems to be so. I'm not sure why it matters, why it's so important. I remember when I did a tour when I was in Massachusetts about many years ago. I did a tour of Lexington and Concord. I think it was called the Freedom Tour or something like that. And one of the main themes of the tour was the shot heard round the world. The first shot of the revolution, was it in Lexington or was it Concord? And it was like a big machlokes, and it's very, very important. So, the same thing here as well. It's very important to know who the first Rosh Yeshiva was, and that distinction goes to Rav Moshe Rosen. But that's the historical record. So he was a Rosh Yeshiva there for a couple of years, somewhere between 1 and 3 years. And so there's the Torah Vodaath elementary school, there's the Torah Vodaath high school, and here he's being brought in to be the Rosh Yeshiva of the whole operation. And then there's the post-high school, which was his main position. There was about, it seems, 11 post-high school students at this time, including Rav Pam, who was a Talmud of Rav Moshe Rosen. And this was the initial post-high school program. And he delivered the shiurim to the post-high school boys. Now, there weren't that many post-high school boys at the time. Everyone went to work, to college, this is at the time. So after a couple of years, it kind of disbanded. It didn't work out. It was unsustainable. There was some exchange of students from New Haven before, after. That also took place. New Haven was a bit of a competition with the post-high school program at Torah Vodaath at this time. But the idea is that it kind of like disbanded. The post-high school, the Mesivta, the high school of Torah Vodaath flourished and continued. And then a couple of years later, the post-high school in Torah Vodaath continued again, and that's when Reb David Leibowitz went and assumed the position. So that's why he left. It disbanded. There was nothing left for him to deliver the shiurim to, because he was, going for the higher level, not for the high school students, for the higher level older students. So he becomes the rabbi in Brownsville, Amboy Street Shul, Anshe Radishkovitz. After he was there for quite some time, for nearly 20 years, until he had to leave, and he opened the shul in his home on 238 Herzl Street in Brownsville. He had problems with the shul because the shul was moving towards conservative. They're officially Orthodox. They were not part of the conservative movement, at least at that point. But they were moving towards, there was modernist trends. There was an issue about selling tickets for Yom Kippur services. They had the big Chazon Ish, and later on, years later, was Moshe Kasavitsky, all these famous chazanim. So they had to sell tickets, which was fundraisers for the shul, and also and there was no Erev in Brownsville. So Rav Moshe Rosen said, you can't sell the tickets. People are going to carry the tickets to shul on Yom Kippur. Well, they said, we have to sell the tickets, and people will carry. That's their problem. They need to show the ticket. So they had a dispute about that, and it really reflected a wider dispute about the direction of where the shul was going. And it was just at that time that he got sick, and he was unable to come to shul for a couple of months. He fell ill. He was bedridden. It was just around that time. The Agudath Harabbonim said no one should take the position, because as soon as he recovers, he's taking it back. The shul went ahead and advertised that the position is open, and someone took it. So there's some bad blood there. And Rav Moshe Rosen ultimately had to leave the shul as a result, and he opened this shul in his house on Herzl Street, which was where he was, a small little place. He had some of his wealthier supporters underwrite him, but they soon left Brownsville for the wealthier, the middle-class neighborhoods of Crown Heights and other places in Brooklyn. Brownsville was considered a working-class, poorer neighborhood, but those people continued to support him even from far. And at the same time, he has this tiny little shul in Brownsville. He rises to national prominence in Orthodox circles in the United States, in the Agudath Harabbonim. He's invited by Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan to succeed Rav Moshe Soloveitchik in 1940. There was a dispute on the board if Rav Soloveitchik's son, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik's son, Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik, Rabbi Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, should succeed his father, or should they hire someone else? And they wanted to hire Rav Moshe Rosen. Rav Moshe Rosen turned it down. Possible that he did deliver shiurim there for a short period of time temporarily. That's what it says in the YU Commentator magazine. My friend Davi Safir showed me that source. But he definitely turned down the position. In 1948, he was invited to become, I'm not sure because Rav Herzog was the chief rabbi there, but he was invited by Rabbi Yehuda Leib Fishman Maimon to assume some sort of chief rabbi position in Israel, in the new state of Israel. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Fishman Maimon was close with his father-in-law, Reb Hil David Trivash, back in Europe. He was like a Ben Bias by him. Rav Moshe Rosen was a religious Zionist. He was associated with religious Zionism. So was his father-in-law, Reb Hil David Trivash. So he had that political stance, a supporter of Israel, and to buy trees in Petach Tikva. He encouraged his shul to plant orange trees there. He would fundraise for these causes as well. He struggled financially for quite some time, and in his later years, he had a bit of money, and he supported the Chazon Ish, he supported the Brisker Rav, and others. He was one of the heads of Ezras Torah. He was one of the initiators of the Vat Hatzalah rescue efforts during the war. He encouraged the rabbis' march on Washington in 1943, but he was too elderly and sick to attend. And then he had his post-war involvement in Jewish education. Locally in Brownsville, he had Chaim Berlin, which he was involved with, and then he also helped Reb Aaron Kotler found the Lakewood Yeshiva. And then especially an interesting story and a close relationship developed between him, Rav Moshe Rosen, and Reb Leib Malin, who had great respect for Rav Moshe Rosen, and he helped him establish Beis HaTalmud, which was right nearby, right near Brownsville, in East New York. It's amazing how Reb Aaron Kotler, Reb Moshe Feinstein, Reb Leib Malin, Reb Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, and so many other leading rabbis saw him as the greatest Torah leader, Torah scholar, Talmud Chacham in America at this time. They saw him as the greatest, the biggest Talmud Chacham, the biggest Torah leader in the United States. And Rav Moshe Rosen cared about the everyday Jew in Brownsville as well. When a Jewish worker would do some work in his home, he'd always overpay him. He would say, "Do me a favor and take another $1." He would support many people financially in a discreet fashion. A very interesting individual. So this, those were some of his accomplishments in the various capacities that he had in his years during the United States. When he's in his 80s, he was right. His wife had passed away. He was still involved in the Agudath Harabbonim. He was in charge of the kashrus. He was in charge of all the shechita in the tri-state area. He would inspect 10 shlachtais, 10 slaughterhouses on a regular basis. He and Rav Pinchas Teitz together. He had a relationship with Reb Liu Young and met most of the leading rabbis in New York City and beyond at that time. Would work with him. He was didn't try to get overly politically involved in anything, besides for his Zionism and his support for that. But he tried to remain out of politics. He had a telephone in his house, which was quite rare at that time, 1930s, 40s, 50s, to make himself more accessible for people asking halachic questions, and to make himself as accessible as possible. At his funeral, 1957, he passes away on the second day of Sukkot. He had one of the largest funerals in Brooklyn history. The streets were closed off in Brownsville. 20,000 people attended. There was police there directing the area as they closed off all the blocks. Rav Moshe Feinstein said to delay the funeral till after Shabbos, to have full hespedim, despite it being Chol HaMoed. Reb Aaron Kotler, Rav Moshe Feinstein, Reb Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, Reb Avram Kamenovich, Rav Pinchas Teitz, Rav Nissen Telushkin, all delivered hespedim at his funeral, and then at his Shleishim gathering, which was held at MTJ on the Lower East Side. So Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Lezer Silver, Rav David Lifshitz, and family members all delivered hespedim. So it's quite amazing that someone who made such a significant contribution to American Orthodoxy, and his halacha, and his sfarim, and in the rabbinate, and in education. And he had this relationship with all the other Torah leaders of his day, and with people and individuals, and he's relatively unknown today. So I hope this episode did some justice in telling his story and sharing another slice of the history of the development of American Orthodoxy. So this was Yehudi Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudigeber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites at Podbean or your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.